Welcome to Masterclass, a collaboration between the virtual world diplomacy community and Brotherboard's Diplomacy Dojo. The host for this week's episode is Brandon Fogel. Brandon is an organizer with the Chicago-based Windy City Weasels and is a co-founder of the Diplomacy Broadcast Network.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us today for our Masterclass. I talked Brandon Fogel into giving a talk today. You all know him from DBN. He is very passionate about the game of diplomacy. He has a lot of insights about everything. He is leading the Weasels annual contest just about 5 years running. How many years in a row is it now, Brandon?
No, Chris Kelly had the top spot a couple of years ago. So
okay, so it's been interrupted, but he's a pretty regular topper of the Chicago Weasels, and he's here to talk to us about alliance play and whether or not it is even a good idea. Please help me welcome Brandon Fogel.
Thanks, Natty. It's good to be here. I've paid attention to the Masterclass series, and it's been really great for the hobby and really fascinating to see these people come in and talk. I'm going to lower everyone's expectations. I've done some preparation for this. I've put together some slides, but I haven't. Apart from talking about this topic in sort of snippets on DBN, it's not something I've really sort of articulated in detail before. So it's probably going to be a little bit messy, and hopefully I'll get the sort of main ideas across, and hopefully surprise you guys a bit based on what your impression of me might be from DBN. Okay, what did I want to talk about today? Well, the idea I had is that this notion of alliance is obviously really central to diplomacy, and it's something that we talk about a lot when we talk about diplomacy. And it's also something that we posture about a lot. And so I think, I wanted to try to cut through a little bit between what people say about alliances versus what they actually think about alliances, and also offer my thoughts about what I think a good ally is and what makes a good alliance, and also include some thoughts about what alliances themselves are actually important for in not just diplomacy, but also what we can learn about our relationships and how we approach relationships outside of diplomacy from our diplomacy play. And I've picked out a couple games to analyze as just not in detail, but some certain moments from them. And they were both games that I was a part of, just because easier to remember those and pick out important moments from them. All right, so the question that I ask here, what are alliances good for? I'm going to redirect that a little bit for this first slide that I put up. Here are things that I think people sort of say when they talk about what a good ally is. And it's things like never stabs or never thinks of stabbing. And there's often some sort of moral import in how they talk about this as well. Like a bad ally is a bad person. And a good ally is inherently a good person. So for me, I consider this a sort of simple alliance or a simple alliance play. Somebody who just gets in an alliance, doesn't think about stabbing, doesn't look for opportunities to reorient the strategic situation. And these are great allies to have if you can find them, but they're not good ways, I think, of being an ally if you want to maximize your score. And so first, why do people think this? I think there's lots of interesting reasons for this. A simple one is just that we have these moral beliefs that come to us independently of diplomacy. And easy ways to characterize some of these moral beliefs are that lying is wrong, betraying people is wrong, making an agreement and breaking it is simply wrong. And those are ideals that are inculcated in us from a pretty early age. And they're important for societal stability. And so I think we just kind of bring these to diplomacy as well, these moral intuitions that guide how we interact with people. And diplomacy is a game where we interact with people. So it's natural that we would bring these ideas into the game. Another sort of less virtuous motive here is status play. We are people who So mammals in general, but humans especially, are beings that have, I think, an innate sense of status. And status is something that we strive for. And we don't usually pass up opportunities to gain status, which often involves putting other people down. And since lying, sorry, not laying, I assume laying is an independent set of values associated with it, but lying is what I meant to write there, and betraying are considered shameful, and shaming others improves our social standing, our status, essentially, and we just don't pass opportunities like that up. So I think, we bring that kind of behavior into diplomacy as well, again, because that is, diplomacy is inherently a social game, and those are the social apparatus that we have and that we bring to everything that we do. Another one is just simply strategic. In diplomacy, it's really useful to have people who behave in that way, who don't lie, who don't betray, who always keep their deals. So to the extent that we can cultivate those sorts of people, it's useful for us to have them as allies. All right. Well, before I talk about what I think makes a good ally in contrast to those things, I want to talk about a couple concepts here that often get talked about in diplomacy, especially unit efficiency. And this is something we talk about a lot on DBN, and it's really important for tactical purposes. And I tried to articulate this. I don't think anyone's sort of done a detailed definition of what this means or how to calculate it. So, if any of you guys out there are interested in doing some diplomacy theory, this is an area that could really use it, articulating what unit efficiency is and trying to work out ways to calculate it. But here's a rough stab that I offer. A unit efficiency is how much your units promote your center count, either through growing that count or at least maintaining the centers that you have if someone's trying to lower them. Like I just said, this is hard to define precisely, but it's often clear when it's being done, when unit efficiency is being maximized, or when it's not being maximized, when people are failing to use their units in ways that promote their own success. Things like leaving units unordered. We often complain about this on DBN because it lowers the ability to leverage the resources that you have to generate more resources. But there are cases where holding actually does promote your center count, especially if it discourages someone else from moving on your centers. So, merely holding is not obviously a detriment to unit efficiency, but it often is. But again, it's a kind of a fascinating topic. It's really important, and certainly there should be master classes on that. But there's real work to be done there if anybody out there wants. But all right. So in addition to unit efficiency, the concept that's more interesting for me here is what I'm going to call strategic efficiency. And this isn't something that we've talked about. This is something that kind of gets talked about obliquely, I should say, but never kind of directly. And so this is a concept that I kind of want to introduce for this conversation and see how it works in terms of how we talk about alliances. All right, so what do I mean here? Here's how I try to define this. How much you are strategic efficiency is how much you are leveraging the strategic configuration on the board to do work that units would otherwise have to do. Some possible ways that this might happen. You might form an alliance that feels strong enough that you don't even have to protect your home centers, so you can leave them unoccupied, even though the ally may have units nearby. And that's a way to leverage your resources to try to gain more resources. You can use units to go try to get other dots rather than merely protecting your home centers. And if you're doing it because you know that your ally has better things to do with their units, and you can trust that they'll understand that. Well, for me, that's this notion of strategic efficiency. You are generating more potential by leveraging the strategic situation on the board. All right. So, what do I think a good ally is? Is this one who views you as a genuine partner rather than a source of dots or merely a tool for some other purpose. So what do I mean by genuine partnership? Well, that's what I want to try to talk about fully here. But if any of you guys are philosophy nerds out there, and I have been in the past, This is an idea that it's actually kind of central to how I view life in general, or how I view how I treat other people, and it has an echo in Kant's categorical imperative. So Immanuel Kant was a big philosopher back in the 18th century. Pretty late in life, sort of created this volcano of philosophical content. And one of the things that he did, and one of the things he's best known for, is a system of ethics that was really different from anything that came before. And one of the core elements of this ethics was what he called the categorical imperative. It has many formulations, but one of them is this. And this is the one that's always resonated the most with me. And he thought that this imperative was sort of self-evident in a way. It's a little complicated what that means, but he thought that this was at the heart. Sort of everything about his ethics stems from this. And one of the formulations is this: it's to treat people not merely as a means to an end, but also as an end in themselves. That takes a lot of unpacking to understand what that means. But one of the, for our purposes here, I understand this as treating the other people as somebody who has goals that are worthy as yours. And for me, that's what a genuine partnership is. You're treating the other person not merely as a tool, as something that you can use in order to gain something else, but as somebody who has goals that are worthy and that you are willing to help. Now, there's a key word in here in Kant's categorical imperative, and I've echoed it in my own formulation up there, and that is merely, because it is not that you only treat other people as ends in themselves, but that you don't merely treat them as a means to an end. Doesn't mean that you don't also treat them as a means to an end. You can do both simultaneously, but you also have to recognize that they are an independent being with goals and a sort of inherent dignity. All right. What does that mean in diplomacy? Well, one important thing is that a good ally should be one that you can be vulnerable with. If the ally is also treating you as an end in themselves, an end in yourself, then that is one that you can relax around. You can be vulnerable with them. You can allow yourself to leave avenues that they can exploit if they want to, and trust that they won't do it. And if you think back to my definition of strategic efficiency, this is a really obvious way to use alliances to increase your strategic efficiency. All right, this is a definition. So unlike the simple alliance, simple notion of ally that I offered before, this is one that works for both players. As I say here, it's a model for both you and your ally. What does this mean, though? For one thing, it means that you have to be willing to substantially increase your ally's chances of doing well. That means you should be willing to give dots. You should even offer them. You should actively consider how to promote your ally's interest. And that involves a kind of partial identification, right? You have to see what it's like to be them, so empathize, and think about what would work best for them. Doesn't mean that you necessarily do it, but you should be seeing it, and sometimes also doing it.
How do you feel alternative win conditions play into this? Sometimes you find a player who is fine losing as long as they end up with the second most dots. Is that incompatible with your definition of alliance play?
No, I mean, my sort of default perspective is is imagining a player who is always trying to maximize their score. So when I hear you say alternative win conditions, I'm hearing somebody who's not actively trying to maximize their score. That's different from the case of somebody who is imagining that the best they can do is like a strong second place. So were you trying to distinguish between those two cases? Let me ask you that.
I guess it does depend on what the scoring system is. Some scoring systems still give you points even if you give up a solo. But assuming that your scoring system doesn't give you any points for a solo, sometimes people don't mind losing just as long as they came in quote unquote second. And is that incompatible with your thoughts of alliance play?
I mean, the type of sort of genuine partnership that I'm talking about here is one that, you know, the ideal scenario I'm imagining is more early and mid game, where both players sort of like they have a world of possibility open to them. If you are, you know, if you're in the late mid game or in the late game where your options are more limited, then you know, the notion of genuine partnership isn't as relevant, because you just don't have the same. You're not equals in that sense. You don't have the same kind of potential. So I have to. Does that answer your question, or do you want me to go further on that?
No, that's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question here of like kind of a distantly related question of how genuine a relationship people with different levels of power can have. So I'm really going off the rails here, but you know, this is why romantic relationships between people where one has power over the other are deeply fraught, and the questions of consent become complicated and very difficult to sort of parse. And so I'm not going to draw the direct relationship here, because obviously there's a lot of difference between diplomacy relationships and romantic relationships. Although, you know, there are also commonalities, which I'll get to a little bit later. But there's something in common there, where if the goals available to you are very different, then the question of having a genuine partnership is maybe off the table. So in that sense, then what alliance means actually in that case, so this is getting back toward actually some commonality there. The question of what an actual alliance means in that case is different, right? If somebody is willing to be a vassal, if somebody's best option is to be a vassal or a janissary, then the realm of considerations is just going to be different. So we could talk more about that a little bit later. But at the moment, that's the extent of my thoughts on it. Okay. So any other questions then before I go on? All right. So here's an example, I think, of somebody who made a really good strategic consideration that in which an alliance, a moment of alliance, created a real opportunity for the other person and ended up benefiting the person who made that consideration a lot. So this is the Weasel Royale, which is the Chicago Windy City Weasels League Championship game, happens every year. And this was the 12th Weasel Royale, which took place in 2020, was for the 2018-2019 season, I believe. It was delayed because of the pandemic. And Corey Nesland, who is a DBN contributor, was playing Italy here. I was playing Russia. You can see I was not doing very well. And a guy named Mike Whitty was in Austria. Mike's a local player. I think he's played a couple of times online, but for the most part, he's local Chicago. Anyway, Corey and I were kind of secret allies from the beginning. We had a wintergreen plan for a long time. We all tried to attack Christian Klein in Turkey here, and he managed to stick around longer than we all wanted because of some infighting among us. Corey had stabbed Austria prior to this point. This is now the winter of 1906. Corey, in kind of a bold move, had tried to put the wintergreen into effect and stabbed Austria. It hadn't worked out. And by the winter of 1906, she and Mike in Austria had made peace, had been able to sort of disentangle a bit. Corey had taken Trieste, but had been able to move down to Greece and then had pulled Venice, which I think was in Tyrolia back. Anyway, this is a moment where Corey had a big decision to make. Does she continue the fight against Mike, or does she try to reformulate the alliance? And Germany here was Ali Adib. And what Corey did is she made the calculation that that she could get Mike to work with her against Germany, and that would suit both of their interests. And so what happens here in spring of 1907 is that Corey sends units west and east away from Austria and trusts that Mike will see that fighting ally, who, by the way, is just tied with Corey for the top spot here. The fighting ally in Germany is going to work for both of them. So she leaves herself completely vulnerable. You can see here, Mike could have gutted her here. If he goes to Venice and then drops down to Tyrolia and Vienna here, he's guaranteed Rome and Venice. It might have worked out for Mike. It's worth, sort of wondering whether he could have pulled that off or not. But from Corey's perspective, this is a moment of great strategic efficiency. She's able to use all of her units for other purposes, namely trying to get some of the remaining French centers and also getting some Turkish centers. And to do that, she had to increase Mike's win chance. She had to give him a real viable path to the win. For me, this is a really great moment of alliance work. What people would call alliance play. We can talk about what they might mean in a little while, but it ends up. Did I not put the last slide? There we go. All right, I've got the slides out of order here. Corey ends up winning this game, and she wins the league championship. And this is the final position. Note that she doesn't have any of the Austrian centers, but Austria ends up pushing Germany back. Corey's able to secure most of those Western centers, as well as some of the Turkish ones, and she's just in great position here. So this game could have gone on longer, but it ended up not, because there was a recognition that Mike couldn't really push her back. Doesn't mean he might not have tried, but in this case, he decided not to. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff about how alliances, what I think they're good for. May surprise some of you guys, given that I like to talk about stabbing and sort of express desire for people to break alliances a lot. I think that's given me a reputation as somebody who doesn't like alliances. And I think people who've played with me know that that's not how I play. There are reasons for that. One is that it's stabs are fun. There's drama that I like, but also I do think people are genuinely a little bit too reticent to break alliances for one reason or another. Okay, so what is the big but here with alliance play? For me, I think you have to remember who your primary ally is, and your primary ally is always yourself. Kant, in that formulation, talks about people. You should treat other people as ends in themselves, not merely as means to an end. And he was really clear that the notion of people he invokes there includes you. So you should have to treat yourself as an end in itself, not merely as a tool to some other end. I think people have a tendency to not do this. They have a tendency to actually put other people above themselves sometimes. Okay, so how do I articulate when you know this? There's going to be a point where promoting your chances of doing well is incompatible with promoting your allies' chances. And I think it's you owe it to yourself to constantly evaluate where that might be. For an example for this, I'm going to go back to the Broadcaster Brawl, which I played with bunch of the other broadcasters online, on air, I should say. And here, if you guys watch this game, this was a famous moment, the big moment of the tournament. Of the game. This is a couple turns before that. This is fall of 1906. So I am playing Russia here, and Siobhan Nolan is playing Italy. I didn't realize that I picked out the exact same countries. So this is a wintergreen, one that we actually were able to put through. And you can see by this point, excuse me a second. By this point, we have actually succeeded with the wintergreen. We've destroyed Turkey and Austria. Austria here is Chris Brand, and Turkey here is Brian Prevel. And we succeeded in getting Brian to become Janissary for us. And so he ends up being the tip of the spear that we point at the Western powers. But here's a moment in fall of 1906 where this wintergreen is ascendant, and I offer Siobhan, I go to Siobhan, and I see that she's got a problem with France on her Western side. I don't have immediate threats. So rather than building two here, which I would if I did not tell and follow through with giving Siobhan Bulgaria here. This is sort of that's the center that didn't need to be transferred. And then I went to her and I offered it to her. So it wasn't something she asked for. I went and I offered it to her. And this is something that, so it gave her 2 builds. And I only got 1, whereas it easily could have been the other way around. This is a moment where I saw that if the partnership was going to work, she needed the build more than I did. And so I did this, I did this thing which definitely increased her chances of winning. Whether they lowered mine or not, it's an interesting question, but they definitely increased hers more than they increased mine. So this is a moment where I definitely I wouldn't say that I put her above mine, her needs above mine, but I did view her needs as important. It's possible, it probably likely as well, actually, that giving her Bulgaria increased my win chances more than not giving it to her. But it's true that it increased hers more than it increased mine. And I was fine with it. I was genuinely fine with her winning this game if it happened. If you follow the game, you know that that's not what happened, because a year later, I end up stabbing her and going on to win the game. So, we can talk about whether this was, why this stab happened or not. For me, it was clear that if I could get the stab and get away with it, then my chances of winning were significantly greater doing that than they were staying in the alliance. Does that make me a bad person? No. Siobhan gave me a lot of grief on the stream afterward. But I viewed a lot of that as posturing, to be honest. The sort of posturing that I talked about at the top of this, where shaming me and trying to project a specific. First of all, it does a couple of things, right? It gets me to be potentially less likely to stab her again in the future, but also creates a reputational effect, which might benefit her and work against me. From my perspective, this was a really successful alliance for both of us. It's one that increased both of our chances of winning greatly, I think, to a point where really it was going to be one of either of us who were going to top this board. And it came down to which one of us managed things from that point better. And I happen to get the upper hand here. When I look back on the Weasel Royale championships, the last 4, I think, have come down to either me or my ally winning. And for me, that's really successful. That is, I'm really happy that my allies won the ones that they did. I'm happy that I won the ones that I did. But either way, that's a successful alliance. For me, that's the way to play alliances in a way that maximizes chances. There are other ways to do it, but over the long run, that's what maximizes your chances when you treat your allies as genuine partners. All right, so go ahead.
For the purpose of illustrating the term of strategic efficiency that you were talking about earlier, do you see that as an example? I mean, it sounds like from what you did earlier, by helping Siobhan get those 2 builds, you were knocking down a potential topper in France, and you were also defending, you were making sure you wouldn't have to defend the former Turkish centers from a really sweeping French movement over time. So is that what you meant by strategic efficiency earlier?
Yeah, 100%. Thank you. That's really nice. Yeah, this is, I would say this is a moment of high strategic efficiency where I'm allowing this potential conflict between Italy and France to do work for me that my units might otherwise have to do.
Right. And then it sounds like there's also one other element here, which is that as you work through the alliance, you may be setting up the potential for a stab that you could take or not take as the game goes. I'm not sure if that's maybe a third element in addition to the strategic and unit efficiency, or if it's part of one of those.
It's definitely a distinct concept. So even if it's like a sub part of strategic efficiency, it's worth articulating. So part of that, right, too, is also building up, allowing someone else to be in the lead and become a target. There's sort of different elements of that. But in general, there's a sense of getting units to move away from you to create space for you to make some sort of move. Yeah, that's worth. Yeah, this seems like a kind of strategic efficiency, but it definitely seems worth articulating. That's a nice point, Ben. All right, so let me summarize here. I've talked maybe a bit longer than I expected to, which is fine. All right, to summarize, for me, I think it's important to think of alliances as genuine relationships. Treat allies as ends in themselves, not only means, but also, so I guess I want to reemphasize that, if it feels like there's a contradiction here because you're doing both at the same time, I want to say that there's not a contradiction there. It's, in fact, unavoidable to do both at the same time. It's overly idealistic to think that you could only treat people as ends in themselves. You always have multiple motives working at the same time. The important part is to include as one of the motives to treat other people with as if they're entities with goals that are worth pursuing. A simple example of that, by the way, I'll digress here for a second, is when you take a taxi. If you could take a taxi in a way that treats the person as if they are kind of worthless, but there's also a way in which you can treat them as if they are a person who has inherent dignity and whose goals are worth pursuing. Their life goals are worth pursuing, and both of those involve giving the person money to take you somewhere. So your goal is never not part of that. But the way that you treat that person does make a big difference in the sense of the interaction. In diplomacy, it matters because the things that you do will differ in both cases, whether you're treating them as ends in themselves or only as a means. For me, this means that you have to actively promote your allies' interests, but only as long as you're promoting your own as well. And what I would stress is that it's important as a diplomacy player to be active in evaluating that balance. You want to be reevaluating every turn whether your interests are better served in the alliance or out of the alliance. And if they are better served in the alliance, then really take the alliance seriously and treat it like a genuine relationship. Okay, real quick then, before I turn the floor over to questions and discussion, I think there are some interesting life lessons to pull out of diplomacy from this. If you were to sit down and list what you think makes a good friend or a good partner, they would most likely include at least these two. They're someone you can be vulnerable with, and someone who views your goals as at least in part their goals, kind of identification. But you should remember to be a partner to yourself. That means don't stay in a relationship merely for the sake of it. Don't be a simple alliance player in life, as well as on the diplomacy board. This is where diplomacy gets to be sort of like therapeutic, a little bit of transference that shows up in psychoanalysis as well. You can learn something about yourself and how you relate to other people by how you play diplomacy. And you can use diplomacy as a kind of playground for figuring out how to find that balance between supporting yourself and relating to someone else and finding ways to make their goals important for you as well. Why isn't diplomacy like life? Because there are moments in diplomacy where we get to the point where resources become scarce. And there's only so much to go around. This just generally doesn't happen in life, thankfully. We do like imagining when it does. So game shows like Survivor or narrative shows like The Walking Dead, these are places where the supply centers run out and there's competition for them. And people have to actively consider whether it's better to be working with others or not, with the basic proviso that you are much better working with people than without. But you have to find the right balance between doing so and not doing so. And just to finish, there's a reason why these shows feel like diplomacy, and it's because those are the ways in which diplomacy is like life. And that's one of the reasons that I love the game, because it brings out these aspects in a way that can be playful and safe. If people are managing things correctly in terms of the code of conduct and how people are relating to each other as people. This is the thing that makes diplomacy most interesting to me as a game, quite apart from the sort of endless strategic complexity. It's the way that it is about how we relate to each other as people. And that's where I'm going to stop and turn the floor over to discussion and questions.
Brandon, when you are deciding whether or not an alliance serves your interests, when you're making the decision, which you say has to be done every turn, is this something that only comes from experience, or is there something more formulaic about it? Like you think to yourself, if I don't gain a supply center in the next 2 years, it's no longer serving my interests. Or if I'm not able to defend myself this way, it is no longer serving my interests. So is it more impressionistic, like that you just have a feel for when it's working for you, or is there something more mathematically concrete about it?
God, wouldn't it be nice if we could reduce this kind of question to a set of equations? No, I think ultimately it's going to, you just have to develop an intuitive sense. There are, I think, certain things that you end up being able to see relatively easily. Like if two come to mind here, if I fall below this threshold, like dot threshold, 3 or 4, it's usually somewhere around there, especially if I've got enemies on some other front. If I fall below this certain threshold, then either I'm not going to survive or my chances of winning are going to be completely destroyed. Those can be moments where you might claw at the edge of the lifeboat and think that an alliance is no longer working. The other is when it's, for me, I mean, that's a desperate situation, so it's probably not the one I should have started with. But for me, generally the only times that I look to break alliances are if I have a chance to secure the board top, and obviously that depends as well on what the larger context is, where you are in the tournament or the season. But it's no, there's no real formula for it, but it's a matter of figuring out what goals are important to you and what actions are likely to advance you towards those goals in a way that has a high likelihood of success. Did I just completely dodge your question, Natty? I'm sorry.
No, I think that does answer it. My question was more about if this is only something about experience or some sort of rubric you use. And I guess what you said is the rubric you use is you look for the situation that makes you secure the board top or the tournament top.
Yeah. And the first scenario I suggested is one where you have to break an alliance, not because it's going to get you the top, but it's merely one for survival. That's relatively rare. Yeah, for me, it's really more about whether your goals are better served in the alliance or outside of it. But that's just, it's a question of figuring out how to. That's part of a larger skill of figuring out how to evaluate what courses of action are worthy for are good for advancing your goals, and that's hard to do, and it's something that you definitely get better at with practice.
If I can offer a quick sort of concurring opinion, and it sort of underscores what Ben and Brandon were talking about in the Broadcasters Brawl. Brandon made a very big alliance play, as he pointed out, by just offering a center to Chauvin. But the principles that served were it empowered Chauvin to keep fighting France, which pushes the conflict away from where Brandon is, which suits his interests. And it also builds confidence in Chauvin. So as someone just watching the replay of the game, what we saw was that Chauvin got really overextended, then Brandon stabbed her. And now with what Brandon's revealed, it's like, oh, that's why she had the confidence to overextend herself, because Brandon gave her Bulgaria. So he's obviously on her side. So build confidence in the relationship that let Brandon take advantage of it at a later time. So both strategically, it was great for him.
Yeah, but I think what I want to be clear about is that I genuinely was on her side at the time. Like it wasn't, it was not. And it's important, I think, it's not important. Just obviously it helps me reputationally to sort of point that out, but I don't think I would have seen it if I had merely been thinking about my own interests. This is the point I want to make: is that in order to be a good ally, you really need to be a good ally. The thing is, you can't drink your own Kool-Aid in that sense. You have to keep in mind that that you also have to be an ally to yourself, and that means evaluating at every point whether the alliance is good for you going forward.
Yeah, I think part of what I meant is that by giving Chauvin confidence, you keep her from, say, cutting a deal with France and coming back against you. So it kind of removes the temptation for her to stab you.
Yeah, so it works on multiple levels, but ultimately, right, because it was helping her. Yeah, right. It was still a good alliance. Still a good. I mean, her mistake ultimately there wasn't trusting me. It was not protecting herself.
Yeah.
So in that case, she didn't need to convoy that army away. She had a spare unit ultimately. I don't know if she didn't realize that she didn't need to do that, or if she was, drinking a different kind of Kool-Aid that, say, the alliance was secure no matter what, and that's the kind of simple alliance play that I think is dangerous for everyone involved. Unless your ally is doing it and not to.
Yeah, I think that's definitely on Chauvin that she would sort of, as you said, she drank her own Kool-Aid and got overconfident in the alliance. Another question I had, and you may have covered this earlier, I came in kind of late and at an awkward point because it was a game where I got crushed. You were talking about the Weasel Royale, and I was France in that game, and England, Germany, and Italy all came at me at the same time out of the gate. And Ali did something very interesting in that game where he was part of this three-way alliance to take me down, but he was also feeding me what Italy was going to do so that I could defend myself better against Italy. And eventually, it wasn't because he wanted me to survive, but he was just putting himself in better position to get my dots because I could fight off Italy better.
And so you take that as...
I don't know if you want to comment on what Ali's approach to the alliance was as far as being part of the alliance, but also sabotaging parts of it so that he would come out with sort of a better share of the spoils.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting case, right? Where it doesn't sound like Ali was being a true ally to you.
No, not at all. I'm talking about his alliance with Corey.
With Corey, that's what I meant. It wasn't being a true ally to Corey. He was definitely in a different mode where he was using her to harm you and try to get better position for himself. Whereas I think he may have been treating Brian Pravel in England here in a different way, as somebody who he was willing to sort of help get good position in order to advance his causes as well. Does that sound right, or am I missing something with?
That sounds. Actually, what a great. I think something you want to comment on is, so if you've got a three-way alliance, how do you judge who you keep working with and who you eventually throw overboard?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Because there's likely going to be a point at which you shift how you're viewing one partner or another, and obviously that'll depend on the scoring system. That'll be an influence in how that works, what considerations work there. Yeah, it's similar to what I was saying before. This becomes a question of how you evaluate just which one is going to advance your overall goals the best, which I'm assuming are maximizing your score.
When you talk about the alliance being an end in itself, I can see that on the surface from a metagame reputation standpoint, that you'll succeed better in the future if people think of you as a reliable ally. And I can also see it in a particular game as far as there's a benefit to being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes and consider their interests, and it's going to help you, succeed in communicating better. But do you mean to be implying that there's some a priori reason that you should be treating alliance relationships as an end in themselves, or is it more about the outcomes?
I'd just be careful about the way you're talking about that. It's not the alliance that is that I would treat as a good in itself. It's the ally themselves. So and it's there's always, as we're talking about this before, there's always a dual motive at stake. You can never treat them only as an end in themselves, but there's always a way in which you're treating them as a means to an end that has more to do with your own goals. And the overall point that I would make is not that there is a moral imperative here. So I'm not trying to echo Kant's argument that the categorical imperative is, he called this a synthetic a priori, something that is sort of true in itself, but something that we learn through experience. Not learn through experience, but something that is true based on how we are constructed as cognitive beings. I don't want to argue anything grandiose about my views of alliances in that way. It's all from the perspective of what's going to maximize your score in the long run. And the argument that I would make is that treating people as ends in themselves is actually a way to maximize your score in the long run. And it's a way to both be a good ally and to expect your allies to be. So it's, there are players who try to approach alliances where they want the other player to behave differently from how they would behave. And that is, they want their alliance partners to be simple alliance players while they are not. And so, there are Scorpion type players who do this a lot. Christian Klein is one that comes to mind, although he's interestingly, as he's gotten more aware of his reputation, he has tried to change how he plays a bit. But there are people who do that, who are always looking to use other people as merely as tools. And the argument that I would make here is that is, in the long run, not the way to maximize your score. To be somebody who tops boards regularly and does well. So it's a little bit, I think if I understand the sort of underlying philosophical thrust, I think it's, I would be careful that I'm not trying to argue for moral good here. But I do think that there is a consonance with how we relate to people outside of diplomacy. And I wouldn't want to get into a sort of deeper philosophical discussion here about whether there are moral goods or not. That happens to be how I aim to treat other people, is as ends in themselves, not merely as means to my own ends. So it's in that sense that I think diplomacy is a way to learn how you can be, it's a way that I can learn how to better fulfill that aim, is by learning how I do it, how I would do it in situations that, aren't necessarily ones that come about in real life, but that do have elements of ones that do come about in real life.
I think this is a really important distinction to make. And I just want to sort of, I hope I'm not imposing if I jump in here, but I really like that we're playing a game here, and that we are able to be outside of our normal life situations, right? We're able to sort of, like you said earlier, think strategically about what maximizes our own chance to win the game, rather than about how to treat people. And now that's not to say that alliance play isn't really fun in addition to being successful. But it's difficult, right? Because I think what you were saying before comes into play a lot. A lot of people feel negative about diplomacy, or they play and they get burnt out on it, or they have a bad reputation of the game, and it gets seen negatively. I think because we bring morality into it a little bit more than it needs to be. I mean, I used to play football, and no one ever got mad that you tried to beat them in football. You know, I think it's an important distinction to bring, even though it's really hard to do, because we do develop relationships in the game, and that's one of the most fun things about the game. Just sort of wanted to highlight that tension, and that I kind of come down on the side of not carrying moral slights within the game out of the game.
Yeah, it's intense how diplomacy, it's both a game and it's a mirror of how we relate to people. And that if you have difficulty with confrontation, for example, or if you have, attachment theory is sort of interesting here. I don't know about it a lot in detail, but I do know, there's the notion of secure attachment, and then there's lots of other different categories. And if the way that you connect to people is somehow difficult, if you have difficulties in relating to people, they will come out in diplomacy. And so if you're able to recognize that diplomacy is, if you're able to see diplomacy as a place to safely play with those ways of relating to people, and to allow the difficulties that may come up in other contexts to come up here, and find ways to both accept that those things come up and then to figure out how to work through them. That's a way where diplomacy can be like genuinely therapeutic and a way to improve as a person. But that's really hard. Like, all of those things are really hard to do. Therapy can be really hard. I'm a huge proponent of therapy. I've done it a lot over the course of my life, and I recommended people do it a lot as well. But it's hard. It can be really hard to examine the things that make it hard for you to connect with other people. And so if you're not comfortable doing that, and it comes out in diplomacy, then yeah, diplomacy is going to be hard for you to enjoy the game. But I have friends who have played diplomacy and figured out how to, they've seen these difficulties come up and they've been okay with it, found ways to be okay with it, which was not easy. But then they found ways to use diplomacy to improve as a person, who has confrontations with other people, and we're ultimately better off for it. I know it's worked that way for me. Like, I wish that I had found diplomacy as a kid, because it would have been a great way to learn how to find balances between, my goals and other people's goals, and to be able to handle confrontation better. But man, it is hard. And these are some of these things that come up in diplomacy, these difficulties with relating to people. Those can be fundamental to struggles that people have in life in general. And so for those to come out in a game context in front of other people, especially strangers, that can be really hard. And I definitely am really sympathetic to people who don't enjoy diplomacy because of that. I wish, I wish for them that they're able to, they could find a way to enjoy it anyway, and use diplomacy therapeutically, but definitely can't begrudge anyone who finds it too difficult for that reason. Would anyone else have a question or comment?
There seems to be discussion going on in the chat. I don't know if you all want to. It is an interesting discussion.
No, I haven't seen the chat at all.
Well, it's just following on this point. I don't want to encourage anyone to speak if they don't want to speak verbally, but I do think it's an interesting conversation.
I think we just want to interrupt more than anything.
Yeah. What I wanted to add to Malitsi's point was, me and Ben had like 2 bad games before I played with him during VDL, and we didn't get played well together. And then on the VDL game with me, Ben, and Karthik, I were able to patch things up, and it worked out in our favor, and he learned how to trust me and whatnot. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. I'm sorry, I'm really hungover right now. I'm just gonna shut up.
It's this sort of reminds me of the other half of Ben's point, is that diplomacy is a place where a lot of us end up making friends and forming pretty close relationships with people that we would not have met in any other context. There's something about the kind of person who's okay with the play with relationships that have diplomacy. It seems to be a particular kind of person, and yeah, those people can form really great friendships. Ones in which there is more room for play, just because we're used to playing with relationships on the diplomacy board. But yeah, but it can take some work to get there, right? Because Sabi just talked about Karthik learning to trust her. That's the kind of thing that
it was Ben learning to trust her. I stabbed her ruthlessly, or not stabbed, I attacked her ruthlessly because
it wasn't a stab. We were never allies.
Yeah. I just attacked her ruthlessly.
Yeah, and I had to use Ben as an ally, and while also giving him advice on moves and whatnot. So I gave him a service in exchange for protection against Karthik and whoever England was.
It worked out really well, and I was Italy and Sabi was France in both of those games where we didn't work well together, and then when we did work well together. But this sort of goes to my point partially, is because at the risk of reputationally damaging myself, I really liked working with you, Sabi, and I'd really like to work with you again. But I am not of the opinion that you always work with somebody if you like them. You know what I mean? I want to look at the board.
Agreed.
Yeah. Right.
I agree with that. I was just saying that, yes, if I wasn't flexible our past 2 games together, I would have not worked with you. But due to the fact that I was flexible, I was able to work with you. And I knew we both had a common goal going into the game was to get a better rating, whatever.
Maximum power. Right.
Yeah.
This does go to Brandon's point about relationships also. It's very interesting. It all gets very interconnected. And one of the points I was making when I said my first thing is that I really love the competition of the game. And I don't like when that gets lost in the morality of the game, despite my enjoyment for the relationships that are built also.
Yeah. And I think one of the one I want to, that I've tried to make here is that morality is kind of unrelated to the game. It is metaphorically, because we're using some of the same brain pathways and cognitive tools, but the reason why we follow those off the justifications for those off the board and on the board are very different. This is actually similar to what Maletsky was getting at earlier, and I answered it by saying that on the board, what matters is score maximization. That's, for me, that's ultimately the justification for any general approach. Whereas off the board, right, you're not really, your motivations for adopting certain ways of relating to people, they do end up having general moral sensibilities to them. You're not really thinking about maximizing the resources that you have, although you might, right? That could be part of your considerations, but it's likely not going to be the foundation if you ended up probing yourself. It's likely that you do have a moral sense. Where that comes from is another question, but these two different justifications, they end up using the same cognitive apparatuses in both on the board and off the board. There's a couple of things I want to say here that you guys made me think of. So first of all, I just that when Sabi said that it's Ben, not Karthik, had to learn to trust her. It's just me. That's just great, right? That's the sort of thing that you say about friends. But this is a way in which that relationship building is similar, both on the board and off the board. The other thing I would say is that I think that this rubric, this way I have of talking about alliances as being true relationships, like a good alliance is one in which each person is forming a genuine relationship with the other, even if it's only temporary. I would add that our relationships are in a way, but this is a good sort of tool for learning how to recognize whether other people are good allies or not. Try to evaluate whether they are viewing you as a means to an end, or as merely as a means to an end, or as somebody with goals that are worth championing. And that's something that you actually can learn to discern. And for me, it's the number one thing that I look at when I'm looking at whether somebody is being a good ally or not. do they actually care about allowing me to increase my win chances, or are they really just trying to use me, as maybe Ali was to Corey in that particular game that Chris was bringing out. David Hood, I see you lurking. Do you have any comments from your experience in the broadcaster brawl about alliances? Yeah, maybe he's not able to talk right now.
Well, I had to get to a stopping place because I was driving to the post office to get the office mail.
Nice.
Because I'm basically double dipping right now. So
you're working on Father's Day.
Well, yes is the answer to your question. What was your question again?
I was just curious in the broadcaster brawl. I talked about that earlier as an example of how alliances can function as genuine relationships, and also when they might cease to be as useful as not being in the alliance, from my perspective. But I was just curious because you never really had an ally in that game.
No. Which might just be a failure of my diplomacy. But the one thing about that game that I think makes it different from other games is that we all knew each other at least on some level, and some of us knew each other really, really well outside the board. So it was almost a unique set of interpersonality relationships, I think. In relation to playing at a virtual tournament or a VDL game where you sort of know the people, you've played with them before, but I mean, some of us on that board had tremendous interaction over months and years. And I think that actually made it easier to go back and forth in terms of alliances than it would have in the situation where you don't know each other quite so well. At least that's my perception. Plus, Brandon, you just suck is the answer.
Something that's been bouncing around here that I haven't articulated specifically is the distinction between what gets called alliance play and balance of power play. And I thought of trying to put together a slide for this, and I found that I couldn't even really articulate a strong distinction between the two. Simple. I could do a simple extreme distinction. Simple alliance play is where people form alliances and don't think about breaking them, and simple balance of power play is where nobody forms alliances and they always just attack the leader. But if you try to articulate more sophisticated versions of those, then they end up sounding a lot alike. People stick with alliances as long as they are better off in them than without them. And if balance of power play is they stay with an alliance until it starts minimizing their chances of winning, and then they break it and try to form a different alliance structure that does maximize their chances.
Right. And I'd also like to say, I think the balance of power aspect is exactly what chooses one to believe that an alliance either is or isn't working in their benefit. Like when you see potentially, either your ally or someone else on the other side of the board that you and your ally are currently working against as a critical means of checking the board top, then you'll probably be inclined to say, hey, this alliance isn't in my interest anymore because of board realities, aka board balancing as a priority. So I do think they actually go hand in hand with board balancing, not just being part of alliance play, but being the decision calculus that determines whether or not the alliance play is working.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really nice point. Because now you can imagine scenarios such as where your alliance partner, you're in an alliance, you both have been successful, but your alliance partner has been significantly more successful. And if you don't turn on them, then they're going to definitely top the board or solo or, run away with it in a way. And so, that's a moment where if you are actively evaluating your own chances, you might need to stab them. Another scenario is where somebody on the opposite side of the board has broken. You might think that you have a chance to outrace the person on the other side of the board by stabbing your ally. That's a scenario that people often go for. Those are ones that that seems to me a very narrow chance of success. Obviously, it depends a lot on the exact situation.
Yeah. So when I was talking about on the other side of the board and racing, that wasn't what I was mentioning. I was more mentioning that you have two powers on the other side of the board, and you're allied with the other person on your side. You may say, hey, I need that other person on the other side of the board to be free to defend themselves against the potential board top. So I need to stab my ally to free them up because we can no longer attack. It's not in my interest to attack.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So maybe you are England and France against Italy and Turkey, and Italy needs the freedom to fight Turkey. And so you attack your ally, France, in order to allow Italy to, you basically reconfigure so that you as England are with Italy, both fighting France, and Italy can fight Turkey. Yeah. Yeah. And that's a nice moment as well. You're switching alliances. So you are no longer prioritizing. So you're England in this case, and France has been your alliance partner. You're no longer prioritizing France's ends, but you have adopted another ally, and you are doing things that will significantly increase, say, Italy's chances of topping the board. But that also happens to be the path that increases your chances of topping the board the most. So yeah, there is more to say. Back to Natty's question from much earlier, there is more to say about how to figure out when it's worth breaking an alliance. But yeah, but it's complicated, and somebody should write a book about that.
If I could take a stab at the definition that I just tried to think of, I think when you're playing alliance play, you're trying to cultivate trust as a currency that you can use to improve your that you can use to maximize your strategic efficiency and accomplish goals together. And it's really the building of trust as currency that makes it different than balance of power play, in which you have more flexibility to act in your own interest or in different ways, but you have less efficiency because you're having to guard against everyone at once.
Oh, I see. So it's like another level of strategic consideration, is what you're saying, above even like you could have two levels of strategic efficiency, and you're talking you're saying that alliance play, you want to carve out a definition of alliance play that has a kind of meta importance, because there's this second order good that you're calling trust that you can cultivate.
Yeah, not meta beyond the individual game, but I mean, if you're England and you're attacking France on your own, that's one thing. But if you and Italy are both attacking France, you're more likely to be successful, right? So if you can do things that if you can act in the way you've told somebody you're going to act, and then they count on you acting that way going forward, you have a new path to success besides the sort of tactical balance of power. That's how I see the difference.
Yeah, and you want to say that that's an element of alliance play and not an element of balance of power.
Balance of power. Well, that's the cultivation of trust over the course of multiple turns is what I was defining as different.
It should be pointed out that what you're saying, Ben, can also be accomplished not by alliance play. Like, you can cultivate trust by other means, by demonstrating consistency, by establishing détentes. Like, for instance, if you consider the French-Italian border, you can build a lot of trust over the course of the game just by never going in the Piedmont, Gulf of Leon, Western Med, North Africa spots, right? So, and that's not an alliance per se. That's just a détente.
Yeah, that's true. Although you could, if you were making a technical definition, you could define that as a form of alliance. Although I can see how it's not a true alliance.
Right, because an alliance, I would think, has shared goals, right?
Right. But if you have that border and then one of you are succeeding and you do not break that border, then you're not playing balance of power play anymore. It's an alliance move to not break the border.
Right. That I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a distinction there between whether you are doing things actively to promote the other person's interest or merely passively not not detracting from them. And you can imagine with Italy and France, they might be collaborating actively against Germany, something like that. Yeah, that's interesting. But the idea that there are that you can distinguish balance of power play versus alliance play by articulating sort of second order benefits that like trust or credibility even. But I think you could argue that for balance of power as well, because I think Dave is trying to get at this a little bit. You can sort of demonstrate your ability to read the strategic situation effectively and establish yourself as a competent player. Even when shifting alliances, if people recognize that your reason for shifting the alliance is well-founded, then that's a kind of currency as well that you can use in some way later in the game.
Yeah, I think, like Brandon said, the two aren't mutually exclusive. Like balance of power play is just something you should, to an extent, be doing all the time in the background, if nothing else. Whereas alliance play is going to be situational, because typically, like I said a second ago, you're going to have shared goals, and if those are offensive goals, if you're not just defending against another alliance, then from turn to turn, you're going to need to, consider the consequences of what you're doing and potentially reassess. And that might cause the alliance to fall apart or, strengthen conversely. So, I think alliance play is something that's could easily be conjoined or not with balance of power play. I think they're just very, they operate on different scales.
There are different moments, right? I think it's like the same way of thinking about the game, just applied to different moments of the game. One in which, we talk about alliance play when people are growing together. We talk about balance of power play when somebody is about to break out and the board needs to be rebalanced in some way in order to keep one's hopes alive. But in either case, you're sort of making the same consideration, whether sticking with the alliance structure as it is better for you than not.
And it's also got, I think another issue as far as is just the defining the term, if does it there are some obvious cases of alliance play, right? When you're England, I'm France, we both attack Germany together, that's an alliance. But let's say you're England, I'm France, and Ben is Germany, and Ben and I are doing things together on a front, and you're just sitting on your hands and negotiating for us to give you centers when we get too far ahead. Are you in the alliance? If so, why or how so? etc. I think there starts to be gray areas when you're trying to define the term.
Yeah, but ultimately, for me, the question is: Are you viewing me as as some? Well, one of the fundamental questions is: Are you viewing me as somebody whose goals are worthy? And if you're sitting on your hands and not helping me in any way, then you're not.
Well, if you're sitting on your hands because you're not, your other choice would be to attack me, then I think that's good, right?
Oh yeah, if it's Turkey behind the lines and they have nothing to do other than attack you and they're not doing it,
right?
Right. Yeah, fair.
I was there are plenty of times where you won't have active support for moves or anything like that, but it would still definitely be considered a true alliance. I can think of my Dixiecon game with Ed in round 2, where we are France and Italy, and I don't think we gave each other's moves support more than once or maybe twice. But that was still a very, very functional, very, very up-tempo alliance based on mutual trust, where neither of us moved units towards each other without coordination of those moves, and it allowed us basically to have super huge unit efficiency in terms of where our units could be placed and how fast they can move, because we didn't have to worry about defending our border much at all. And I think that's there are plenty of times where do not get in my way alliances can be almost as effective or just as effective as actively entangled and supportive alliances as well.
Yeah, and in that case, you both were trusting each other's ability to read the strategic situation and recognize that that this course of action was better for both of you, rather than pulling some dopey stab that just ruined things for both of you.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that for me, that's one of the things I wanted to try to get at with that notion of strategic efficiency. You're using the strategic situation on the board, which included your evaluation person and their ability to read the situation as a way to increase your own unit efficiency. A follow-up though on this other idea of like whether somebody is helping you or not. I often see as Turkey a Turkey who tries to form an RT with Russia that involves Russia putting the fleet into Romania in the first year, and this seems, on the one hand, attractive because Russia is not in the Black Sea and, less likely to stab you from that respect. But that fleet can't help you in any way. So it can support Bulgaria potentially, but almost certainly going to get cut. So if you're trying to create an RT, if you're Turkey and you're trying to create an RT and you need to be able to advance through Austria, Russia has to put an army in Romania. So that's a case where, if your alliance partner, if Russia is insisting or suggesting putting the fleet there as a way to form an alliance with you as Turkey, that's a case where they're likely not thinking of how your interests are going to be advanced. So a bit of a sidebar there, but overall, Natty, I think maybe it's time to wrap this up.
Yes, thank you for your time, Brandon. It's been a really interesting discussion.
All right, thanks, guys. This was really fun, and hopefully we figured something out.
You've been listening to Masterclass. To participate in future Masterclass sessions, please join the Virtual World Diplomacy Community's Discord server by following the link in the episode description. And remember to subscribe to the Diplomacy Dojo podcast for Brother Board's Dojo, as well as future Masterclass recordings. Thanks to Frederick Larden for the music Robot is Chilling, used here in our intro and outro.